One day, my mother-in-law's chronic illness worsened and she had to be hospitalized. The responsibility fell on my husband, John, and me to take care of her. John has 2 older brothers, but they left her college in the city, landed jobs there as well, married city girls they met, and built their homes in the city. Therefore, they seldom returning to our small town. The last time we saw them was at the 3-year memorial service for their father, my father-in-law. It was only the 2 brothers who came, even for the 3-year memorial service. Their wives and children, who had been well taken care of by my mother-in-law, were conspicuously absent. They might think it's none of their business since their husbands came, but the brothers' wives told me, "It's a hassle, so we'd rather keep it to family only. The travel costs are already in the hundreds of dollars." After discussing with my mother-in-law, we decided to hold a 7-year memorial service just between us and her. But then her illness took a turn for the worse and she had to be hospitalized again. Since we have a small child at home, we can't bring them to the hospital, so they're staying with my parents. My mother-in-law feels guilty about burdening my parents, but there's really nothing we can do about it. John helps out as much as he can, visiting after work to bring laundry home or help clean her up. We've let the brothers know about the hospitalization, but they haven't visited or sent any gifts. Despite this, the wives of the brothers are still complaining about not receiving the seasonal premium fruits that my mother-in-law sends them every year. "You're aware that my mother-in-law is in the hospital, right?" I said. To which they replied, "You should be more thoughtful and send something over." The fruits she sends are luxury items that we rarely get to eat ourselves, even in our hometown. The only time we can enjoy them is when we visit my parents. When I told them we are not well enough to send a box worth of hundreds of dollars, they sighed and said, "This is the only time being from a small town is worth anything." It was really infuriating. We ignored the message they left on my in-laws answering machine, but then they called our house. They were complaining about not being able to share with their friends because they hadn't received their share. My mother-in-law reassures us that she'll pay us back for what we spent on her care, but we've been covering some of the smaller expenses out of pocket. When my father-in-law passed away, all of his estate, which isn't worth much more than a couple of $1,000s, even if we sold the house and land, was inherited by my mother-in-law for her retirement. She's not impoverished since she had a bit of pension, but she's not well off either. Despite this, she's been sending boxes of products worth hundreds of dollars from local farmers to both of her sons' families every year. It's something the locals rarely get to taste since it's not sold in markets, only at farmers markets. It's expensive, and for us, a family struggling with kids, we can only get a small share from my parents or my mother-in-law. On top of this, there have been no signs of gratitude or return gifts from the brothers' families. My mother-in-law once complained, "They don't even call to let me know they received the boxes." When John told his brothers about her hospitalization, their reaction was just bland, "Oh really?" and didn't say anything about visiting. Apparently, my mother-in-law was hoping her sons would visit, so I felt bad for her. A few days passed, and things went downhill. Last night, my mother-in-law called from the hospital. She wanted me to send some luxury fruit on behalf of her sons. Frustrated that she couldn't get anywhere with me, it seems she directly called the hospital where my mother-in-law was. Naturally, the patient herself couldn't answer, so a nurse brought a note with a message. It turned out it was the eldest son's wife who made the call. The note had wrote something like, "The second son's wife is struggling because nothing has been sent, so please hurry up." My husband John was the one who answered my mother-in-law's call, and he finally lost his temper. He told her, "If you're going to go out of your way for both brothers' family, we're stepping back. We'll ensure complete nursing care and laundry services are taken care of. Since we served as guarantors, we're done here, right? The rest is up to your sons." Apparently, he also planned to shout at his brothers over the phone, "Buy your own fruit online." I had a suspicion that my mother-in-law was favoring her accomplished sons, so there was something refreshing about the situation. From that day on, John strongly advised me not to go to the hospital, so I decided not to. Since my mother-in-law's condition is improving and her life is not in danger, I plan to do as she says. Since John chose to stay in our hometown, we took care of my father-in-law during his illness and after his death. At that time, my mother-in-law was also going to the hospital, so we did what was asked of us, like visiting him. However, after my father-in-law's death, I was the only one who was able to take actions on the weekdays, running around and dealing with all the paperwork, carrying my baby on the back. At that time, I thought it couldn't be helped since my mother-in-law didn't have a driver's license. Yet, I never received any gratitude, let alone thank you from my sister-in-laws. Today, my mother-in-law called and said, "Have you sent it? If you don't hurry, the good ones will be gone. And why aren't you coming to the hospital today? Did someone get a fever? You can leave them at your parents' house and come here." I felt like I had woken up from a long dream. So I told my mother-in-law that John said we didn't need to take care of her anymore, that we wouldn't be able to afford the premium fruit because we're always on a tight budget. Then she grumbled over the phone that I lacked thoughtfulness for a woman, that I should have sent something even if not asked to, that I was low level because I only graduated high school, that we should act humbly towards her house because my sister-in-law graduated from prestigious universities. I'm a high school graduate with limited capabilities, so I'll excuse myself from taking care of you, Mother. I found myself retorting spontaneously. My heart was pounding for a while, but when I did report to John after he returned home, he said, "That's fine, don't go to the hospital again." My husband John apparently told his brothers, "The wives have been asking for premium fruits for Mom, but she's in the hospital and I have no plans to send her any. If you guys want her to have them so badly, bring them when you visit her." When his brothers responded that they didn't have time and that the travel would be expensive, he replied, "It's unfair for just my wife and I to care for Mom. We've been doing it so far, now it's your turn, guys." And with that, he ended the call. Looks like there's a conflict brewing, but there's nothing I can do. Probably because John only has a high school diploma, our family seems to be looked down upon. His brother-in-law and their wives all graduated from famous city colleges, presumably in New York. I think my mother-in-law takes great pride in that. I never minded taking care of the in-laws in the past, and I have plenty of friends who, despite their usual conflicts, step up when someone falls ill. I thought that's what you do. John standing his ground felt good, but I was startled because we live in a small town surrounded by relatives. Before my mother-in-law could complain to them, I decided to pay a visit to my uncle, who had acted as our matchmaker. My uncle knew that we were the only ones taking care of my in-laws and promised to explain the situation to the rest of the family so that my mother-in-law wouldn't badmouth us. He just asked us to accompany her when she gets discharged from the hospital. Since we don't know when she'll be discharged, if it's on a day off, John will go, and if it's a weekday, I'll go with my uncle. He also promised to question my mother-in-law on why she treats her children differently. Then just recently, my mother-in-law's sister, my aunt, called to complain. Apparently, since we've given up caring for my mother-in-law, she has summoned my aunt to the hospital. She said her children should look after her, so when she asked to call her sons, it turned out she had already done so. But the wives of her sons told her, "We're too far away and can't come. We're also tight on money because of our children's education expenses," and hung up on her. I had a headache. Since it was a weekday and John rarely gets days off, I thought I'd have to go, but considering what was said, I didn't want to. Honestly, I didn't want to see my mother-in-law's face anymore. I figured when she's discharged, she'd ask us to come help, and it felt really depressing. Even if John had turned her down, the family around us didn't seem to approve. My aunt is taking care of her bedridden mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law usually says, "She's doing a tough job." I thought calling my aunt was a form of harassment against us. I wonder why those of us who stayed in the local town end up drawing the short straw. I ended up feeling envious of the luxury lives of my brother-in-law's wives, who is both out of local town. I discussed it with John when he got home, and he called his eldest brother. They talked for a while, and apparently other relatives besides my uncle and aunt had called the eldest brother's place. So the two brothers are going to come back for the weekend to discuss how to take care of their mother in the future. At the discussion, along with the two brothers, John and I, uncle, aunt, and the other relatives were going to talk. I've decided to make a detailed list of the money I've lent to my mother-in-law that hasn't been returned and the things I've done for her. I presented this to the family meeting, which included my mother-in-law who was temporarily discharged from the hospital. During the discussion, my mother-in-law insisted that her eldest son, who lives in a single-family home and graduated from a good university in the city, should take care of her. In the end, he reluctantly agreed to take her in. After her discharge from the hospital, my mother-in-law moved to the city with her hospital referral letter and my late father-in-law's memorial tablet. As for the remaining family home, my uncles and aunts suggested that my husband should keep it, considering he couldn't go to college. However, we declined as we didn't need it and moved into an apartment on my family's side. We have not informed our addresses or contact information to my mother-in-law or my brother-in-law. John and I also decided to change our mobile numbers, which had been in use for 3 years, and remove our landline phone, effectively cutting ties. We thought that this would be the end of it, but recently we received a phone call from my uncle that my mother-in-law had returned to the family home. My mother relayed the message to us. Apparently, the eldest brother's wife had been very cold to my mother-in-law because the eldest brother had made the decision to take her in without consulting his wife. She had even been told to get her own meals by herself, even if it was right after being discharged from the hospital. After a month, she couldn't take it anymore and asked her second son for help, but he also declined since his wife had already been cautious about the situation from the start. That's why she returned to her original family home. Just because my uncle contacted us doesn't mean we plan to help my mother-in-law. During our discussion, John was hurt when my mother-in-law told him, "You were a poor student and had no choice but to stay here in the small town. You're my disappointing third son." She even said she was disappointed that I, whom John met and married at his job after graduating from his vocational school, only had a high school education. We no longer feel the need to appease my mother-in-law after such harsh words. I had been wary of this situation from the start, given the way my sister-in-law had acted, and that's why I didn't take my aunt and uncle's advice to move into the family home. But I never thought she'd return in such a short amount of time, especially after the eldest brother boasted, "If you hate taking care of mom so much, I'll let my wife do it." I expected her to at least stay longer. In our discussion, I had a list of daily necessities that my mother-in-law had used and the money I had spent on her, which I had been keeping in the household budget book. I also wrote down the things I did for the family home, like going to the city hall to get a burial permit after my father-in-law's funeral, dealing with pension procedures, and the transportation costs for taking my mother-in-law to the hospital. I made copies and handed them over to John's 2 older brothers, my uncle, and my aunt. John's 2 older brothers said it was only natural because they're her children, but my uncle and aunt said it was unfair for John alone to bear the burden. They told my mother-in-law to return the money that he had fronted. My mother-in-law glared at me angrily and threw some money at John from her wallet while saying, "You've been influenced by your wife." Even my uncle seemed to lose his patience with the situation. He stood up and slapped my mother-in-law. In the end, she dismissively spat out, "I don't need a child like this," to her. It seems that was when my husband John was able to make the decision to cut ties. Here's a funny side note, the money that my mother-in-law had thrown at us was short by a few $1,000s when we counted it later. We went to my uncle and aunt about the missing money, but we also told them we're not claiming it, thinking of it as severance money. Afterward, my real mother received a call. It seems my mother-in-law had called our old home. "It's pitiful to be taken in by a daughter-in-law who has done nothing for my son. Since she's back, I'll come and take care of her hospital visits," she said, as if it was only natural. My mother replied, "We didn't ask for a sister-in-law to come, and the married couple are already adults. We have no intention of interfering. I heard that you said you didn't need your youngest son and went to the city to be taken care of by your eldest. Why are you here?" After that, she hung up without a word. 2 years have passed since then. After that, it seems that my uncle, aunt, 2 elder brother-in-law, their wives, and my mother-in-law had a discussion. We had moved after my mother-in-law went to the elder brother's house, so we received a message through my parents' house from my uncle to participate. But John said, "I fulfill my responsibilities as a child. If any money comes in, please offset it by disclaiming my inheritance." So we did not participate. I know about what happened after a while from my aunt. The wives of my brother-in-law said they wanted my mother-in-law to live locally and be taken care of by us, and they wanted us to take care of all her care in old age. In return, their husbands would renounce my mother-in-law's property. It's a really good condition, so the youngest couple should accept it. Not knowing what they were jealous of, they said that since the youngest could only live locally, it was natural for those who remained in the local area to care of their parents, alternating between the 2 of them. By the way, my mother-in-law's property is just a 30-year-old house built on an 80-square-foot plot of land in her pension. Here in the countryside, an 80-square-foot single-family home is on the smaller side. This isn't meant to belittle my mother-in-law's real family, but it is a fact. In fact, my real home, being a part-time farm, has a 200-square-foot plot of land, and my brother is building a house on the property. Even so, the value of the land isn't much, and to think they could lure us in with such a thing, it was a stark reminder of the fundamental difference in thinking between the wives of my brother-in-law and us. In the past, we didn't do it because we could receive the house, but because she was John's mother, we felt obligated to be there for her because we were nearby, and she must have felt lonely being left alone. My mother-in-law must have felt lonely back then. She even thanked us. However, from the persistent demands for premium fruit by the wives of my brother-in-laws, we came to understand all of my mother-in-law's true feelings and nature and grew to loathe everything, thus becoming estranged. Still, it seems that our intentions did not get through to the wives of my brother-in-laws at all. My aunt too has taken care of her mother-in-law when she got married, so she tried explaining to my brother-in-law's wives that it's not how they think it is, and even voiced her opinion to my mother-in-law, but it seems like they just couldn't understand each other. After all, my mother-in-law just wants to live with my successful brother-in-law in the city, as she's always been telling people around her, and she insists that they take her in no matter which one. Despite the continued disagreements that came after, it seems like in the end, they rented an apartment near my eldest brother's house, with my mother-in-law's pension and assistance from my brother-in-law. But my brother-in-law's wives have made it clear they won't look after her at all. If anything happens, they plan to rely on caregiver support and admit her into a facility. Now, it seems my mother-in-law frequently calls my aunt saying she's lonely. Through my family, my aunt requested my husband, John, to contact her sister who's not been the brightest but still pitiful. But he refused, saying, There are things that are unforgivable, especially because she's a parent of mine. The third son who could only go to a technical college, who doesn't shine in comparison to his older brothers, who could only marry a high school graduate, who could only get a job in a company that doesn't even air commercials on TV, who wears a polo shirt to work and wears work clothes while his brothers go to work in suits every day. I feel sorry for John, who was told to his face by his mother that she wouldn't be able to boast to society if such a third son and his wife took care of her. I understand how John feels, so I probably won't forgive my mother-in-law in the future. I am proud of John, who works hard every day dripping with sweat, because he is the man I love. The trigger was premium fruits, but I'm really glad that I woke up this time and learned not only about my brother-in-law's wives, but also about my mother-in-law's true character. I've been living in my hometown for a long time. I like it here, and I thought I cherished my mother-in-law. But it seems she didn't feel the same way, and she probably hated being looked after by the poorly performing third son. After moving to a new house, we no longer had to worry about going to the hospital, and we have a bit more free time and money. Our child is also a bit bigger, and we have more time to ourselves, but now we're living happily as a family of 3. Because of my mother-in-law, John had a very sad face for a while, but now he looks much clearer than before. For John, this is his home. We want to continue living happily as a family in this house.